the NYU psilocybin cancer trials, and had a whole change of heart. But first, to give you a little background on it, these kinds of trials and experiments had been happening, way before, for years. It's been done back in UCLA, back in the 60s and 70s. There were therapy trials in which LSD was used to see if it would help to alleviate anxiety and depression, those things that often follow cancer diagnosis. So this is not new, but it was stopped because the government made the drugs inaccessible and illegal. And so those therapies kind of went away until only just recently. They are now being retested. The government is allowing special dispensation for researchers to use these chemicals and see how they can be helpful in helping these patients. So it's very interesting that science is at the point where they're willing to at least open the door to these sorts of things, because there's so much of the so-called spiritual involved in that kind of therapy that the traditional scientists would feel a little bit uncomfortable with. But I think there's a recognition that the tools that they do have in traditional science aren't working very well for many people. So the more information they can get about how these things work and how the brain works, the more tools they may be able to develop. So I think that's a good step. So, Patrick Metis. And this is again from Michael Pollan's book. And he describes the journey that he made during his NYU trials with, I believe it was psilocybin that he was working with. He says, "You're in this room, but you're in the presence of something large. I remember how after 2 hours of silence, Patrick began to cry softly and say twice, 'Birth and death is a lot of work. It's humbling to sit there. It's the most rewarding day of your career.'" This is a comment from one of the researchers about what he witnessed Patrick go through. This researcher, again, this is one of these scientists that understands that they don't have a lot of tools, particularly in psychiatry, to help people who are experiencing what he calls existential distress, which is the sort of the combination of depression and fear and anxiety that often accompanies people who have terminal illnesses. So, this Patrick Metis, in 2010, began being treated for his cancer, and he was diagnosed, he had been diagnosed 3 years earlier, and it had begun to metastasize faster at this time. He was 53. news director for television. And having this diagnosis, he read about these trials at NYU, and the article in particular he read was one called "Hallucinogens Have Doctors Tuning In Again." That was in the New York Times. And he heard about this research being done, and he wanted to be involved. So they gave him 2 dosings, one of them an active placebo, which apparently they used niacin, which is it's really it's available in supplement form. It's a chemical in your own body, and if you take it, it sometimes produces a tingling sensation. And then the other dose would be a capsule containing the psilocybin. And he would have 2 sessions, and it would take place in the treatment room that they had designed. And these treatment rooms are pretty much what you would expect for something to be conducive to a psychedelic experience. Lots of easygoing jazz and spiritual kind of music, like Ravi Shankar and Philip Glass and Brian Eno and other New Age artists, and candles, other paraphernalia from different mystical or religious belief systems. And he began his journey with his researcher and guide telling him to just kind of trust and let go and explore whatever comes to you. Look it straight in the eyes, confront it. Try not to flee or run away from anything. Because apparently, under these circumstances, fear can, kind of produce more fear. So the idea, basically, which goes back, as I said, to the 70s, was the idea of escaping the prison of the self. Using psychedelics to really reduce the ego and create a sense of egolessness. That would be of help in getting a sense of transcendence or self-transcendence. So back in one of these early LSD trials, there was a woman, one of the patients involved in the trial. She had ovarian cancer, and she described her shift in perspective after being involved in one of these LSD sessions. Now, this is LSD that they used and not psilocybin. There is a difference, but they are both psychedelic chemicals that help to achieve a sense of self-transcendence. And she said, "My extinction is not of great consequence at this moment, not even for me. It's just another turn in the swing of existence and non-existence. I feel it has little to do with the church or talk of death. I suppose that I'm detached. That's it, away from myself and my pain and my decaying. I could die nicely now if it should be so. I do not invite it, nor do I put it off." And many of these other patients in the 70s, experiments that were done at Spring Grove, we've talked about those experiments in the 70s. They talked of cosmic unity, such that death, instead of being seen as the absolute end of everything and a step into nothingness, appears suddenly as a transition into another type of existence. The idea of possible continuity of consciousness beyond physical death becomes much more plausible than the opposite. Well, I don't know that I needed drugs to see that, though, but certainly it does, for many, offer that kind of perspective or shift in perspective. It just seems to me that it reminds me of the concept of, is there life in outer space, on other planets? This is something that no one claims to have definitive proof of, but most scientists, even the disbelievers and the skeptics, say, well, it seems likely that there would be, right? So to me, it seems like consciousness is something that seems to operate above and beyond the physical, so it seems likely that it would have some sort of transition. But that's just me. Anyway, on we go. Let's continue with Mr. Metis' story and what he experienced there. Early in his journey, he encountered his brother's wife, who had died of cancer more than 20 years earlier, at the age of 43. She acted as my tour guide, he wrote, and didn't seem surprised to see me. She wore her translucent body so I would know her. And this period of my journey seemed to be about the feminine. Considerable feminine energy all around me made clear the idea that a mother, any mother, regardless of her shortcomings, could never not love her offspring. This was very powerful. I knew I was crying. It was here that I felt as if I was coming out of the womb, being birthed again. My rebirth was smooth, comforting. And that's when he said those words that Mr. Bossis, that his therapist heard, birth and death is a lot of work. So here's some of the other things he said according to the therapist notes. Oh God, it's really so simple. Who knew a man could give birth? And then, I gave birth to what I don't know. It's just too amazing. And Patrick is laughing and crying at this point. Oh God, it all makes sense now. So simple and beautiful. So he continues after this experience. He says, from here on, love was the only consideration. It was and is the only purpose. Love seemed to emanate from a single point of light, and it vibrated. I could feel my physical body trying to vibrate in unity with the cosmos, and frustratingly, I felt like a guy who couldn't dance. But the universe accepted it. The sheer joy, the bliss, the nirvana was indescribable. And in fact, there are no words to accurately capture my experience, my state, this place. I know I've had no earthly pleasure that's ever come close to this feeling. No sensation, no image of beauty, nothing during my time on earth has felt as pure and joyful and glorious as the height of this journey. I was learning a song, and the song was simple. It was one note, C. It was the vibration of the universe, a collection of everything that ever existed, all together equaling God. Then he had an epiphany about simplicity, and thinking about how complicated we make things. And he realized his politics, his food, his music and architecture, and his chosen field of television news